Hello and welcome to our Week 11 overview lecture. This is our beginning of our very final theme of the course. We have this week and 1 week more, and we will have covered a huge amount of ground. The topics that we're exploring over this final theme are things that have already been in the course from the very beginning. We're going to take a look at social movements, and social movements have been one of the factors in each of the previous themes that have been driving historical change. In this week and the following week, we're going to take a look at both some primary texts written by people involved in specific social movements, and then also some theoretical texts trying to analyze what social movements are about, what drives them, what causes particular kinds of movements to happen in particular circumstances. So this week we're going to take a look at some rough categorizations that are often used in contemporary theoretical texts to characterize what social movements are about, what they're demanding, or what sort of tactics they're using. We're going to take a look at categories of movements looking for representation. This might mean representation in the sense of formal enfranchisement, or it might mean meaningful participation in decision-making over the lives of the people demanding representation. Also, recognition, the recognition from other people in your society that you have political rights or moral rights or social rights, that you deserve to be included or considered with reference to particular aspects of your life. We'll take a look at movements for redistribution of wealth or of power, and then also at revolutionary movements. It is very, very common for things to be described as revolutionary, and revolutionary movements have quite different characters, and so there's a very wide range of text to choose from in that category, looking at different kinds of revolutionary movements. So in terms of our first topic, the selection of readings includes Appia, whom we've met in previous topics. Here he is looking at abolitionism and anti-slavery campaigns as a case study in what he calls moral revolutions. By moral revolutions, what he's particularly interested in is the idea that you have these very distinctive periods where what look to be long-standing values that have been held for very long periods of time change very, very suddenly. He calls that sudden change a moral revolution, and in this particular subtopic, the reading is taking a look at abolitionism and anti-slavery as an example of one of these moral revolutions. He's interested particularly in what makes such revolutions possible. Sherry Arnstein is someone that you might know if you've taken classes in policy or social work. She's writing about citizen participation, and what she has in mind are the ways in which citizens engage with social services, with agencies of the welfare state or private or non-profit organizations that are organizing their relationship with the state. And what she's particularly interested in is the concept of participation and how real it is. Is participation, on the one hand, just the way in which people are being informed about what the state's already going to do already, or do they have meaningful control over their lives? And she establishes a typology that has been quite influential in subsequent work in this area. Simone de Beauvoir is one of a number of texts that we'll take a look at this week that is foundational for what's often called second wave feminism. It's exploring the social construction of femininity, and we've looked at social construction in relation to debates over science in the past. Here we'll take a look at some of its political edge, and we'll continue that discussion into some debates next week. James Charlton is a text analyzing the disability rights movement and specifically challenging dependencies, perceived dependencies, or real structural and economic dependencies of persons with disability. The Frederick Douglass text is a text looking at the history of the anti-slavery movement. It is a contemporary text to that movement itself. We took a look at a very small fragment of it in week 3 in the social movement text there. So this is the longer version of the fragment we looked at then, unpacking and providing a history of the movement, looking at different religious organizations that have advocated for abolitionism and other sorts of organizations. W.E.B. Du Bois looking at African American inequalities from a later historical period, writing an appeal to the world that is focused on the contradiction between the foundational ideals embedded in things like the US Constitution or Declaration of Independence, and the actual treatment of African Americans. And like many texts written in a civil rights framework, it is highly conscious of post-colonial struggles that are going on around the world, and is contextualizing its own local political struggle in relation to those post-colonial movements. Shulamit Firestone is another analysis of the women's rights movements in the United States, looking at second-wave feminism, what comes to be called second-wave feminism, but placing current feminist struggles in the context of earlier waves of struggle for rights for women, also other kinds of struggles for civil rights, and particularly Firestone is interested in the material inequalities between women and men, the ways in which capitalism, the ways in which forms of economic distribution of resources is itself affecting women's representation in the political sphere. The Mark Hovell piece is an analysis of the Chartist movement, the movement for political enfranchisement for all male citizens. A lot of the political institutions that we currently take for granted are driven by the Chartist movement. There's one of many famous speeches by Martin Luther King, so a classic text from the US Civil Rights Movement, analyzing nonviolent direct action as a tactic in relation to other kinds of tactics. Why this sort of tactic? Why not going through the ballot box? Why do something confrontational in this way? And on the other hand, why nonviolent direct action as opposed to violence? P.K. Longmore is another text coming out of the disability rights movement. It is a critique of existing discourses of rehabilitation of disability. It's analyzing the prejudices and the structural and policy frameworks that disadvantage persons with disabilities. And it is arguing that there's a tendency to see disability as though it is a physical, natural thing, but you actually need to see it as something socially constructed, that there are aspects of the society itself that are the actual things that are disadvantaging someone who is perceived to have a disability. Malcolm X is providing an analysis of black nationalism as a response to racial inequality in the US, again contextualizing that movement in relation to post-colonial movements worldwide, not an advocate of nonviolent disobedience per se, arguing that the choice is becoming one between the ballot or the bullet, in other words, that things are going to become violent if sufficient representation recognition is not happening. The Wolfgang Streeck piece is an analysis, a theoretical analysis of the political impacts of the shift to more market-based forms of social integration. So as the welfare state rolls back, as citizens become customers, the Streeck piece is analyzing what happens to political identities and suggesting that one of the things that can happen is that those identities fragment, that you don't have a uniting political vision. And then Peter Singer is analyzing the animal liberation movement as an extension of earlier concepts to expand rights. In this case, the expansion of rights involves the extension of rights to non-human subjects. In our second topic, we'll take a look at pieces that are either looking at movements for redistribution directly or are analyses about the reason that movements for redistribution for a period of time in the late 20th century seemed to become less important than other kinds of social movements. The first piece by Richard Cloward and Frances Fox Piven is an attempt to articulate a possible collective action strategy that can be used by the poor, in particular by recipients of welfare, to collectively assert a right to a basic income, rather than to accept that individually one should try to overcome one's disadvantages and get ahead. R.W. Connell, whom we met in the very first week of the course, here in Connell's own research specialization, analyzing the global drive toward gender equality, with a particular emphasis on men's movements and changing forms of masculinity, and how these changing forms of masculinity intersect with movements for gender equality. Nancy Fraser, whom we've also met previously in the course, is looking at the differences between movements for redistribution and those for recognition, and exploring the decline of class identity as a central locus of political conflict, and wondering what this means and what the implications are of the kinds of movements that result when class identity is less central than it used to be. Betty Friedan is another feminist text looking at the consequences of the restriction of women to the domestic sphere in a world in which the public sphere of paid work is so socially central to power, to identity for men. André Gortz is a manifesto for a movement to abolish work. If you think about the text of Keynes that we took a look at a couple of weeks ago, where Keynes was talking about the fact that the production of unemployment is one of the things that happens as a consequence of contemporary capitalist economies. This production of unemployment can be a bad thing with the current organization of work, but it suggests the possibility to create a society of greater leisure that is simply no longer based on work as a central concept. Gortz is exploring something similar here as an active political goal. How do you overcome the centrality of work in social and personal life? He titles the book that this is part of "The Farewell to the Working Class," and it's again this idea that you might have a movement, it might have something to do with redistribution, but it is not about the establishment of a right to work, but rather about affecting the transition to a society where we acknowledge that we have a high capacity to meet material needs, and that specifically human investment of labor into production at very high levels is something that's no longer materially necessary. David Graeber's piece is looking at an ethnographic account of direct action as a political tactic, and looking at it with reference to some very contemporary political movements. Gustavo Gutierrez is a liberation theologist, and this piece is analyzing the possible role of Christian churches in empowering people in the developing world. Axel Honneth is a theorist who focuses a lot on the redistribution recognition dynamic. He's following up on Fraser's piece, also that we've taken a look at in this topic, looking at the concept that struggles for recognition are replacing those for redistribution, and analyzing some possible causes for that shift in terms of social, political, and economic changes. The piece by Paul Lafargue is very fun. It may be a bit hard to read because it is a 19th century text. It's a little bit archaic, but it's a satirical text that's doing something somewhat similar to what the André Gortz is doing. It's advocating for the abolition of labor as central to social life. It's coming from a place similar to what we've associated with Max Weber, the idea that capitalism is specifically an ascetic form of social life. So if you're overcoming that asceticism, you're allowing room for greater leisure, for less centrality of labor to social life, and this is an early piece advocating that idea. The Thomas Marshall piece is quite long. It's quite historically important and interesting. It's analyzing the development of welfare state institutions and concepts of social insurance, and doing this in relation to changing concepts of citizenship, and the way in which these concepts have changed, specifically in relation to social movements, as those social movements have driven for new forms of empowerment of disenfranchised groups. And the Manker-Olson text is analyzing the factors that drive the development of large-scale labor organizations. Again, he's writing at that period of the 20th century where you have large-scale businesses, a growing state bureaucratic apparatus, and you tend to have relatively formally organized institutions for managing the sort of working class contestation. And he's looking at that phenomenon and what's brought it about. And then our third topic is a variety of texts, many different kinds of texts, using this concept of revolution. One of the things that is quite striking about the modern period is the way to which it conceptualizes itself. It thinks of itself as a revolutionary period, a period of constant, ongoing, rapid change. And these authors are each emphasizing different aspects of that change, some of them in relation to things we typically think of as revolutionary movements, and some of them revolutions of another sort. So again, we have a piece from Appia on moral revolutions, rapid transformations of long-held values, and what makes such revolutions possible. Timothy Garton Ash is looking at the revolutions that bring down the Soviet system, so this recent wave of quite dramatic transformation. Frantz Fanon, whom we've looked at before in the course, is looking at post-colonial revolutions and violence as a tactic within these revolutions. Václav Havel is looking at dissidents within dictatorships and specifically thinking about the Soviet Union and the ways in which dissidents survives and the role that it plays and the impact that it might possibly have in these oppressive circumstances. We have a piece by Hitler on the National Socialist movement, on the revolutionary impact that that movement was seeking to have on German and world society. We've got Thomas Kuhn again, whom we read early in the course, on scientific revolutions. So we took a look earlier at his concept of normal science. Here he's talking about revolutionary science and what makes scientific revolutions possible. We have a piece by Lenin on the dictatorship of the proletariat and what this means and how it relates as a concept to the notion that the proletarian revolution is also democratic in character. Piece by Nelson Mandela reflecting on the struggle against apartheid. Mao Zedong on contradictions within the people, so again taking a look at the ongoing and long-term process of revolution within China. Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto. I've linked here to the full piece. We looked at a fragment of this earlier in the course. You've seen countless pieces since then of people saying a spectre is haunting something or another, but not the spectre of communism. This gives you a chance to take a look at the original text in its entirety. It's not a huge text, and it can be worth taking a look at to get a feel for the references that have been running through the other materials in the course, as well as in its own right. And then a text from one of the May 68 uprisings, this one in Paris. This is a mass mobilization, one of the mass student mobilizations becoming a student and labor mobilization. Mammoth numbers of people out in the street, but doesn't succeed as a revolutionary movement. Okay, so those are your options for text this week. We'll follow up on all of these in class and begin to head into the final stretch of the course.